The blatant disregard for international law across the entire occupied Palestinian and boys, sexual and gender-based violence amounting to torture and cruel or inhuman treatment. Israel's total siege of the Gaza Strip has weaponized the provision of life-sustaining necessities for strategic and political gains, including through cutting off supplies of water, food, electricity, fuel, and other essential supplies, including humanitarian assistance. It constitutes collective punishment, disproportionately impacting pregnant women and persons with disabilities, and is causing grave harm to children, including starvation-related deaths. We found that the immense numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza and widespread destruction of civilian objects and infrastructure were the inevitable result of an intentional strategy to cause maximum damage, disregarding the legal obligations of distinction, proportionality, and adequate precautions. Israel also forcibly transferred almost the entire population into small enclosures that are unsafe and uninhabitable. The deliberate use of heavy weapons with large destructive capacity in densely populated areas constitutes an intentional and direct attack on the civilian population. Although Israeli officials have repeatedly stated that their operations in Gaza are intended to destroy Hamas and to release hostages, yet neither of these aims has been largely achieved at the expense of thousands of lives. We found that Israeli forces committed sexual and gender-based violence with the intent to humiliate and further subordinate the Palestinian community. Palestinian women were targeted and subjected to sexual violence and harassment online and in person. Men and boys experienced specific persecutory acts, including sexual and gender-based violence amounting to torture and inhuman and cruel treatment. The Commission concluded that specific forms of sexual and gender-based violence constitute part of Israeli security forces' operating procedures. Excellencies, the situation in the Gaza Strip has overshadowed that in the West Bank, where Palestinian fatalities recorded since 7th October have exceeded any other recorded period. This is linked to increasingly militarized Israeli operations, a trend which we highlighted in our report to the General Assembly last year, as well as a surge in violent settler attacks on Palestinian communities, often assisted or condoned by Israeli forces. The blatant disregard for international law across the entire occupied Palestinian territory has disproportionately impacted Palestinian children. In Gaza, Israeli security forces have killed and maimed tens of thousands of children, and thousands more likely remain under the rubble. Israeli attacks have also severely impacted infrastructure essential for the well-being of children, including hospitals, schools, and basic services. Excellencies, in relation to the attack of 7th October 2023 in Israel, the Commission found that Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups are responsible for the war crimes of intentionally directing attacks against civilians, of murder or willful killing, torture, inhuman or cruel treatment, destroying or seizing the property of an adversary, and outrages upon personal dignity and taking hostages. Members of Hamas, members of Palestinian armed groups, and some Palestinian civilians deliberately killed, injured, tortured, took hostages, including children, and committed sexual and gender-based violence against civilians and members of the Israeli security forces, some of whom were hors de combat. Children were killed, injured, and physically and emotionally mistreated and instrumentalized by attackers for propaganda purposes. The Commission identified patterns indicative of sexual violence and concluded that these were not isolated but perpetrated in similar ways in several locations by Palestinian perpetrators, primarily against Israeli women. I must note that the exploitation of sexual violence in conflict by all parties for political propaganda risks diverting attention from the experience and from the needs of the survivors, as well as further fueling long-standing hostility. Excellency, the Security Council passed a resolution last week calling for an immediate, full and complete ceasefire. The Commission reiterates that call and calls for a complete cessation of hostilities. We call for the immediate and for the full end of the siege, for the release of all detainees, including all of the Israeli hostages, and for Palestinian armed groups to stop the indiscriminate firing of rockets into Israel. The Commission reminds all parties that they must adhere fully to international humanitarian law and international human rights law in protecting civilians and civilian objects. The attacks against UN agencies and humanitarian actors must stop. This Commission will continue its investigations into all crimes under international law with the aim of achieving justice and accountability. The Commission requested Israel to ensure the Commission's immediate access to the Gaza Strip in order to investigate and preserve evidence. And we asked for this in compliance with the order issued by the International Court of Justice on the 24th May, specifically ordering access to this commission. Israel has ignored the request that we have submitted to them. The Commission welcomes and is cooperating with accountability processes in the International Court of Justice and in the International Criminal Court. It calls on all states to support those processes in every possible way. The Commission welcomes the listing of all parties to conflict in the 2023 Secretary General's report on children and armed conflict for committing grave child rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel. We call on the listed parties to immediately end all the grave violations against children and, in cooperation with the UN, adopt time-bound commitment to end and prevent grave violations against children. In conclusion, our world faces the biggest threat of impunity for violations of international law unless perpetrators are held to account and justice is delivered for all victims. The protection and promotion of human rights remains a paramount obligation of all member states. Thank you, Mr. President.